Hi, everybody. My name is Rory Martirana. I am a reference librarian at the Ives main branch of the New Haven Free Public Library. I coordinate our book Sandwiched In Author Talk series, where Joan actually appeared a couple months ago. This is exciting. And many of our new health programs and initiatives at the library. It's a really enormous honor for me personally to be a part of Democracy in America Tonight. I worked at the Stetson Library for about 5 years. So I have a special fondness for Dixwell and the New Hallville neighborhoods, and I'm really excited to listen to Joan. If you enjoy the talk, Joan's book is available from the library for curbside pickup, and her video of her talk with us is on our Facebook page. And I'll hand it over to Matt.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see you. As ever, special thanks to our partners at the New Haven Free Public Library. This is such an important partnership to us, especially Seth Godfrey, Marian Huggins, Luis Chavez-Bromel, Isaac Shub, and now also Rory Moritana. Thank you to my colleague, Karen Rothman, who's done so much for this series, and also Swagoto Chakraborty, who is at work even now behind the scenes on this webinar. Two very quick program notes. Upcoming events 2 weeks from tonight at our regular 7 o'clock time, April 13. Decolonizing the Museum with Chitra Ramalingam, who works at the intersection of photography and history of science, and she's currently a fellow at the Yale Center for British Art. And then later that week, April 16th, a special Friday noon edition of Democracy in America, or I call it Tuesday nights at the Public Library. But Friday the 16th at noon, Christopher Newfield will be speaking on universities and democracies. Chris has emerged as one of the most important analysts of the modern university. He's the author of The Great Mistake, How We Wrecked Public Universities, and also Unmaking the Public University, the 40-year assault on the middle class. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce you to our panelists. Joan Cavanagh is the author of Our Community at Winchester, The City and Its Workers at New Haven's Gun Factory. Dorothy Johnson, who you'll hear but will not see, is on the call. She was the oral historian for that project. And Jeanne Criscola served as the designer for both the museum exhibit of Our Community at Winchester and also the book. And I will toss the mic now to our moderator tonight, Elihu Rubin. Elihu is a professor of architecture and American studies here at Yale. He's the driving force of the urban studies program at Yale, and it is my pleasure to have him joining us tonight for the discussion.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. And yeah, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Matt. And thanks to all of our attendees. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to gather this evening to discuss our community at Winchester and to celebrate the accomplishment of this publication, incredibly dynamic collection of histories, stories, imagery, ephemera. It's just such an exciting addition to the cultural, historical, political history of this place. And Winchester and the area that is now known as Science Park remains central to the public discourse here in New Haven with respect to economic development, adaptive reuse, brownfield remediation, neighborhood change, and gentrification. But too often the labor history of these buildings and places are erased for an easier, more romantic kind of heritage, perhaps, to market the authenticity associated with these places, or to revel in a kind of depoliticized industrial aesthetics. Well, this is our opportunity as a community to correct that and to gather as a group to discuss this institution, Winchester Repeating Arms, that has been indivisible, truly, with the city of New Haven. And so I'm looking forward to the presentations of our three guests. We start with Joan Cavanagh, the author. We move to Jeanne Criscola, the designer, and Dorothy Johnson, the oral historian, to take us through. And meanwhile, I hope you out there will be thinking about your questions and typing them in the Q&A as you imagine them, because after these presentations, we'll have an opportunity to speak as a group. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joan.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And I see my role tonight as to begin with a brief overview of a little about how the project came to be, both the exhibit and the book, and to touch a little lightly on the themes and issues that we address. And then we're going to hear, as you said, from the two women who, without whom literally this book and the previous and the exhibit project would not have been possible. Dorothy Johnson, who is the vice president of the Greater New Haven Labor History Association, is with her sister Lula White and another colleague Mary Johnson. She is the one who conducted 14 of the 18 oral histories in the book. That we used in the book and the exhibit, and they're interviews with former Winchester workers and or their families, and they're really the true heart of the story. And Jeanne Criscola is proprietor of Criscola Design. She designed both the exhibit and the book, using the images that I gave her to complement and illustrate the text in what I think you'll agree is an amazing, beautiful way. She's also, as you mentioned, doing double duty today to share some of those images as Dorothy and I talk. So she's doing a lot of work for this presentation today. So the story of the Winchester rifle has been popularized in legends, films, and books, usually as part of a hymn of praise to American expansionism and or the so-called sport of hunting. So now you have my biases in one sentence. But the Winchester family from 1931 onward played a very important role in the ongoing history of the plant that they founded. I'm sorry, they beyond 1931, they played no role in the history that they founded, in the plant that they founded. Although they made a lot of money off of it, they achieved enormous wealth, and they also had a lot of material written about them. But what wasn't told, and there were three pieces to what I wanted to tell in the history in both the exhibit and the book, was the stories of the people who worked there, the labor history, their labor struggles, and the community that they built. Also the story of the city of New Haven's relationship to the companies that owned the plant throughout the 20th century. And the third part was to bring in something about the advent of Science Park at Yale, which now occupies the former Winchester complex. So Jeanne, this is where you can start with the images and your cat. I'm afraid mine might join us too. But you can start with the images, and hopefully they'll sync a little bit with what I'm going to talk about. But my first awareness of the Winchester plant came during this bitter 1979 and 1980 strike, which is described, can we get that image back?
Is it not showing?
No, I don't see the image. It showed briefly.
Sorry, let's see.
So,
I have to play it. Is it now playing?
No, I think we have a blank screen now.
Huh.
For some reason, when you're pressing play right now, it's going to this blank screen. I wonder if.
Okay, let me just stop the share one more time, and I'll try it one more to see. I might just play it right here, if I can. But usually, is it there now? No.
No, try to share it again, and then just don't press play, because I think it might be large enough for us all to see the pictures.
It's set to play, so it does seem to be telling me that there. Do you see it now?
We're seeing some, yeah, here we go.
There we go.
Here we are. So my first awareness of the Winchester plant came during the 1979-80 strike, and that's described in pictures in the book. It tells a lot about both company practices and the city's institutional response to them. Police were being paid overtime to escort replacement workers, or as we call them, scabs, into the plant to intimidate the strikers and their supporters. And so we had four groups of people within the community who were pitted against each other because the scabs were part of the community, the police were part of the community, and the strikers were part of the community, as well as the supporters. So in the background, there was also another sore issue, which was that in 1975, at the company's request, the city had closed the block between Munson and Division Streets on Winchester Avenue to traffic, which cut off direct access to the Dixwell-New Hallville neighborhood just beyond the plant, which it remained closed in 1979. So in November of that year, of 1979, an aldermanic meeting was held to consider two pending resolutions. The first one was to open the long closed block, and the second to defund overtime pay for the police who were deployed to break the strike. Representatives of local organizations came to support the resolutions to that meeting. And both of the resolutions were discussed behind the closed doors of a smoke-filled room, literally, before the alders finally came out and voted them down after what was a very brief public discussion, as I recall it. But the clear message that we got from that was that the elected city officials were acting not in the interests of the company, of the community, but in the interests of the company. So you fast forward nearly 30 years from that point. And when the plant closed in 2006, I was the director and archivist of the Greater New Haven Labor History Association, whose mission was to document local labor and working class history. We got temporary custody of the records, artifacts, and photographs of the International Association of Machinists Local 609, which had represented blue-collar workers at Winchester since 1955. And in those records, I discovered a treasure trove of documents that showed the struggles of those workers to achieve an equitable working place, which were nothing short of heroic, given the company's long-time rabid anti-union stance and tactics. They also painted a portrait of the culture that workers created at Winchester, and I felt that all of this should be shared publicly. So the project started as an exhibit called Our Community at Winchester, an Elm City Story, which toured around the state and city for several years and is still available online. But I felt that there were some other parts of the picture that I wanted to expand upon. I wanted to include a little bit more of the early labor history at Winchester and to flesh out some of the details of the complicated interaction between the city of New Haven and the plant's management. And I also wanted to begin to look at what was happening in the wake of the plant's demise, hence the book. So the story of Winchester is a story of contrast. On the one hand, you have a company that produced guns and tried to prevent its workers from organizing and to break the union that they finally succeeded in creating. On the other hand, you have workers who modeled a strong work ethic and created a community within the plant that mirrored the community that they created outside of the plant and lived in outside of the plant. And fought an uphill battle in the midst of all of that to create an equitable workplace. Although the company at various times did produce other consumer goods when gun sales waned, and they actually did pretty well at different points. They were fairly competitive, but the owners of the company always knew that the big money was in the guns, the production of guns, and their guns helped to fuel the Spanish-American War in 1898 and World War I, even before U.S. involvement in World War I. Even after the Vietnam War ended and the company's primary focus became the selling of quote unquote sporting rifles, the company once again found itself on the wrong side of U.S. neutrality laws because it was selling guns to sporting goods stores in apartheid South Africa in violation of the U.S. Neutrality Act of 1962. And the weapons were being resold to shoot Black South African protesters. This transgression was described in an expose for the New Haven Advocate, which I think you saw an image of a few slides back, by Marcia Biederman, who was a temporary employee at the plant in 1976. So you contrast the consequences of these unsavory practices with the attitudes and practices of the company's workers. Workers felt a great deal of pride in helping to win World War II against Hitler. But they also showed a much deeper, longer-term pride throughout the company's history about their own skills and reliability and work ethic and sense of responsibility. And this was true across all of the variety of ethnicities who worked at Winchester, particularly poignant for Black workers. And for example, in 1943, one of the people that we interviewed, the late Lawrence Young, came in as a skilled and accomplished woodworker. He and his cousin were the first two Blacks ever hired in the woodworking department at Winchester. And Dorothy may talk more about him. But he was proud of his expertise. He was pleased that he'd been able to find employment at a company where he could use his expertise and also make a decent living for his family doing that. And he was active in his community. This was an experience that was somewhat shared by other African-American workers and workers in general. But especially for African-American workers. Winchester had many drawbacks as an employer, and it was a very racist employer. But nevertheless, it surpassed anything that Mr. Young and others like him would have been able to find in the Deep South, where they were born. So there was also a wide gap between the company's practices and the creative and interactive community that developed within the shop and among workers in New Haven, particularly in the Dixwell-Newhallville neighborhood. Many of the oral histories, and again, Dorothy will talk more about this, I think, evoke a sense of family that was shared among the workers over time at the plant and reflect not only the various social activities that drew them together, but also the sense of pride that people felt about going to work every day at a place where friends, relatives, and neighbors were also employed. Winchester management, and here we have Mr. Thomas I. Boak, who was the works manager for many, many years at Winchester, but they managed industry's oldest strategy against worker organization by pitting certain classes of workers against each other. That meaning skilled versus unskilled, old versus young versus old, white versus Black, etc. And in some companies, that divide and conquer strategy was actually worn down a bit during World War II because of the need to get the war production rolling. But the Winchester plant remained defiantly an anti-union holdout. The United Electrical Workers successfully organized in plants throughout Connecticut during that period, and they seized upon the patriotism and public sympathy for the war effort to aid in their cause. But they failed at Winchester, partly due to Mr. Boak, who was a leader who was called the works manager, which was the position later filled by others. But he'd been there for a very, very long time, and he was a leader in the anti-union lobbying group, the National Association of Manufacturers, which actually still exists. And I think it's funded by the Koch brothers in part. He struck out viciously against efforts of the UE to organize at the plant, and in 1946, locked out over 200 workers from the brass rolling mill, and you see them picketing here in this slide. who attempted to meet with him to redress grievances about overtime pay and piece rates, and who undertook a sit-down strike when he wouldn't meet with them and he wouldn't deal with the issues. They were locked out for a very, very long time, and the case itself was not settled until 1952. I think 101 workers were finally reinstated 6 years later, and did receive some financial settlements. So I talk about that in chapter 4. There's an interview with Wesley Michaelia conducted by Frank Annunziato, who was one of those locked out. However, Huey's struggles at the plant followed by the company's post-war attempt to force the entire workforce to increase production without also increasing pay, arguably paved the way and raised worker consciousness to the need for solidarity among all classes of workers, and thus helped ease the way for the victory of International Association Machinists Local 609 in 1955. And that's all covered in the book in some detail, how that happened and what the company's resistance to that effort was. But many of the workers after that praised Local 609 for helping to reduce pay inequities and between skilled and unskilled workers, and for making it possible for more African Americans to bid on certain jobs that rather than better jobs, rather than the dirtiest, most dangerous ones that they were often consigned to. Workers who had sacrificed and been persecuted by the company to bring the union in felt that their lives did improve as union employees, and that their many sacrifices had really been worth it. But workers in the 1960s and beyond also reported that the stronger the union got, the more the company tried to break its power. And they also said that union leadership played its own role in the dynamic, that some leaders were strong and some others were much too compliant with company demands. So there were 3 strikes in 1962, 1969, and 1979 and 80. They're covered in some detail in the book, and each one of them got a little bit longer. There was 4 months in 1969 that people were out, and that's what this means, 103 days. That was that was an ad taken out in the middle of that strike. And I think it was nearly 7 months in 1979-80. And this reflected management's strategy of dragging its feet in bargaining sessions, knowing that the longer the strike, the more the rank and file would suffer, and thus would be more compliant to whatever the company was demanding. So in addition to the labor history that gets covered in the book, and there's really a lot more that needs to be written and researched about this. This book is really a beginning point for all of these issues, and I want to underscore that again and again and again. But I also describe in some detail what I call the company's repetitive strategy. The Olin Corporation, as I mentioned earlier, owned and ran the company from 1931 until 1981. And in 1981, it was sold, the company was sold to a group of investors, and it became the U.S. Repeating Arms Company, and it continued to have financial losses. In 87, it was sold again to another group of investors, which included the Herstal Group of Belgium's Browning America subsidiary. After a 2-month shutdown with the plant once again nearing bankruptcy, the other 2 owners were bought out in 1990 by the Herstal Group itself, which itself was a subsidiary of Giat, a major arms producer of France. Herstal shut the plant down in 2006 after 16 more years of shrinking employment, followed by renegotiated agreements with the city and further outsourcing of operations to other plants in other states. The repetitive strategy, as I describe it, was two-pronged because it meant that extracting more and more concessions from both the workers and the city. Decade after decade after decade, city taxpayers footed the bill for deals made by the city with a company which continually threatened to leave town or to close, while using these threats to simultaneously demand that workers accept deferred wage increases, even pay cuts, as well as repeated furloughs and layoffs. At the same time, it gained tax abatements and loans from the city of New Haven in exchange for minimum employment guarantees or other agreements that were continually revised or abandoned altogether. So by the time the plant closed in 2006, there were only 186 people working there. And they did not receive the notice that they believed that they required. They only gave 3 months notice. The contract language said they should have had 6 months notice. A citizens group formed to try to fight that. I don't know that they ever were very successful in getting any further pay from that for that period. Finally, the last chapter of the book talks about Science Park at Yale. Although the Science Park Development Corporation was established as a nonprofit in 1981, it was a partnership between the city of New Haven, Yale University, and the Olin Corporation. But it wasn't until the early 21st century and Winchester, the final demise of Winchester, that Science Park really came into its own as the entity that we now know. At the opening ceremony for Building 25 in 2002, the president Yale, the then Yale president, Richard Levin, said part of making it a success is renaming it Science Park at Yale. And he added, this is another event in the unfolding of New Haven's Renaissance. So the questions must be asked, Renaissance for whom? Success for whom? And I think you can imagine why I wanted to juxtapose the two images that you see in front of you. So we're left with a final contradiction and irony. Even with its often unscrupulous management practices and unwillingness to empower workers or to diversify its production, the gun factory which preceded Science Park had more connection and offered more economic benefit over the years to the Dixwell-Newhallville community than this 21st century complex, which includes Yale offices, high-tech startup companies, many with affiliations to Yale faculty and graduate students, one high-priced apartment dwelling in the old Winchester building with its famous entrance at Winchester Avenue and Munson Street, and 2 or 3 high-end businesses. New Haven's working class and poor community have no home there, few jobs there, and very little stake in what goes on there. And so that's how I conclude the book. I want to just say, you can stop. I think you can turn off the images now, Jeanne. Thank you. The book necessarily paints with a very broad brush and tries to cover a range of events and issues. And I want to invite other people out there. Hopefully there are other people out there doing labor history and social history and urban history who will be wanting to pick up on this. But so it wasn't written to be a definitive picture of any of those events and issues, but it was written as an attempt to start talking about them and to start getting them out there. They need to be researched, told, and discussed, I believe, in much more detail. And I believe they're of importance to an understanding of the history and future of the city of New Haven. But I also believe that they illustrate a much larger picture of where we have been as a country, and that they contribute to the crucial discussion of where we want to go as a country. So that's where I want to conclude my opening. And invite Dorothy to come in and talk now a little bit about the process of collecting the oral histories and what they revealed. We have Jeanne is going to share the images as Dorothy talks of most of the people who we interviewed. There were a couple people we interviewed who didn't want to have, who either the photograph turned out really badly, so we didn't use it in the book, or they didn't want to give a photograph. So Jean's going to talk about that. And Dorothy's going to talk about the oral histories, and Jeanne will share those images. Hi, Dorothy.
Hi, how are you?
Okay, how are you?
Good, thank you. What I'd like to start out with is I lived on Bassett Street, my family and I, for 14 years. And I just want to share a little bit about New Hall that I knew when I was coming up. My father worked at Winchester back in the 60s, but he went there. He left Armstrong Rubber Company to come to Winchester because everyone went to Winchester. The pay was much better. But my father didn't stay there very long because the job that he had was a forklift driver. He had to drive in and out of the buildings in the cold. He developed pneumonia and he had to quit and he moved on. But my experience living in Newhall Street, on Bassett Street, was my friend that lived down the street from us. We would walk down to Winchester, where her mother was the secretary treasurer of the union there. And it was like a city within a city. Also, I want to emphasize that when I was coming up in the New Hallville area, we had pharmacies, we had barbershops, we had hairdressing schools, we had A&P grocery store there, and we even had a grocery store 5 blocks away from us. And that's how much the neighborhood has changed. But those were the good days for me. But let me move on to the oral histories that I did. I know that Joan mentioned Lawrence Young. I call him Mr. Young. I went to interview him, and did he have a story to tell? He was a woodworker, but it wasn't easy for him. He went to school at night because they made the blacks go to school at night, and the whites were able to go during the day. Even after you have completed school, you have to be trained on the job. And Mr. Lowry said there are a lot of whites that didn't want to train him to do the right thing, but in his mind, he knew what to do. And I asked him, I said, why did you stay there if they treated you so bad? He said, I had a family, I had to support my family, and I wasn't going anywhere. I was going to stay there, and they finally let him do the woodwork that he should have done. Now, Mr. Lowry was there for over 43 years working. And I also want to mention about Mr. Arthur Bosley, who was the first African-American president of the union, 609. And I asked Mr. Bosley, I said, how did you make out with the other workers? Did they like you or didn't like you because you were the African-American first president? He said some didn't want him to be there, but he said, I did my job. I got along well with everyone. And he said that we really needed a union there because they had such horrible bosses there. He said some people still, regardless, they thought that if they played up to the boss, that they would get a better job, but it didn't work out like that. And he also mentioned to me that I was naive. I thought that all they made was guns at Winchester. I found out from Mr. Bosley that they made flashlights, they made washing machine equipment there. So it was really a very interesting place to be at. Also, I interviewed Mr. Craig Gauthier. He was he was the chief steward at first, and then he became the president. And I know they had a very, very difficult time trying to get the company to allow them to celebrate Martin Luther King Day. After struggles and fights, the union won, and they had a celebration in the cafeteria every year on Martin Luther King Day, which was a plus for them to do. Now, I also talked to a few people about the strike. how was the strike for them? And there's Mildred Hopkins, who said, it was rough to strike. There was anger because some of the scabs, as the union people call them, other people call them replacement workers, they came in, and it was hard to work next to them, but you had to get along because you had to get them in the union, and they did come into the union eventually. Now, Mildred Hopkins had a horrible job. She said it wasn't fit for a man, and it definitely wasn't fit for a woman. But through the help of the union, they got that job corrected for her. There's another woman who has passed away, Edna Hudson. She had been there over 20-some years, and she was out on strike. And I asked her, how was it when the scabs came back? She said, well, I got along with them, but I got a little sick of some of them complaining about the pay. She said, be thankful that you have a job and be thankful that you got a raise and now you're in the union, so now we can move forward. Now, there was one gentleman, Emmanuel Gomez, who had worked at Winchester for over 43 years, and he had the right idea. He said, these big corporations don't think anything of you. You're just a number. You have to remember that. And you have to remember that the union is behind you 100%. Now, there was Mr. James Foster. There's a very, I don't know if they're still around, but there was a singing group called the Ink Spots. And he had a beautiful tenor voice. I asked Mr. Foster, why did you go to Winchester? He said that was the place to go. Everybody was hiring Winchester. So he went there and he got a job. He got laid off quite a few times, but he said he enjoyed his work there. He was able to get in a department that was very difficult. It was the testing department. He was able to go in there. He was able to retire from there. But one thing I asked him, well, you were in the Ink Spots and they travel a lot. How did you manage that with such a tough company? He said, I was able to do it. I did my job. They gave me a leave of absence when I wanted to. And he said, I had no problem. Also, they had singing groups at Winchester. Different ones would sing. Now, Mr. Foster, he retired long before the company closed. And he said, I feel for the people that are still there. He was hoping that there would be a factory or something there other than Yale coming in there, but it didn't happen. Now, there is another person. Her name is Clarita Mack. She went there in the 70s, and she worked there, and she was happy there. But the devastation hit her in 2006 when the company closed. And Joan was right about the severance package. She said, we only got 3 months of pay. Couldn't get the other 3 months. They even went to the governor at the time, I think it was Jody Well, and she couldn't, well, she really didn't do that much, so they were left without the balance of their money. There's another worker, Marie Beauware. She was very frightened because she said, I've worked at Winchester. I was able to support my family. Now what am I going to do? She said there's a lot of jobs, but a lot of jobs require computer knowledge. And she said a lot of us don't have that computer knowledge. But I told her there is life after Winchester, even though it's not there now, but there is life. You will find something better. And she did find something better. She went to Yale New Haven Hospital and she got a job. But a lot of talk that people did when I did the interview, they worried. They said, why couldn't the city do more to help us? They felt the city didn't do enough to help them. And my closing remarks are, Winchester should have landmarks where Winchester used to be to let the public know this historic place was here. People want to know how come you're putting lofts up and not doing more for the community. And I hope that someone will take this and find a way to put landmarks up there where Science Park is, letting them know this historic place, U.S. Repeating Arms, was here. And that's about all that I'm going to say tonight, but I thank you for letting me speak.
Thanks, Dorothy. Hang on, there may be some questions. I'd like
Okay.
to, yeah. Can we move to Jeanne Criscola?
I'll unmute and I'll try to do this again. So good evening, everyone. As I said, I'm Jeanne Criscola, and I want to thank the Democracy in America for inviting our team to talk with you today about this extraordinary project. And I just want to let you know it includes 3 versions: an exhibit, a web version, and a book. As I was preparing this presentation and trying to recall when it began, I went through my archives and found a project brief dated March of 2010. As I recall, Joan was working on grant writing while my friend and colleague Cynthia Beth Rubin and I were fleshing out the details that we had to work with. From what we knew at the time, there were photographs, newspaper clippings, flyers, and all sorts of ephemera to be digitized for the first part of the project, which were to be a series of 26 exhibition panels. By 2013, the digitization, the layout, the production, and the manufacture of these panels you're seeing here were ready for exhibition.
We're not seeing anything here, I don't think.
Really?
I'm getting a blank screen. Yeah, I don't know what other people are seeing. But
Is anybody seeing this?
It's the blank screen again, but maybe
Okay.
we can try it again because it did end up working last time.
Okay, I just don't know what the, see, it seems to be, I see what it is. Okay, operator error. Okay, so I'm gonna just go back to the beginning. I'll just let these run, okay?
Great.
So, all right, so in 2013, the digitization, the layout, the production, the manufacture of the panels were ready for exhibition. And then in 2015, the exhibition was post-produced for the web. So in between 2013 and 15, the exhibition debuted at the Gateway Community College's new gallery space. Discussions there began about possibly turning the exhibition into a book at the opening. The panels you are seeing here are actually quite large. They're 36 by 48 inches. The challenges posed by the final size of the panels required that before we began any design or production, we needed to think through all the stages of the project and prepare a strategy and system for everyone to use and rely on. We all agreed to a naming system that would identify the object. That was easy. The naming system would allow for everyone working on the project to identify the object. At some point after the first layouts were produced, a number system was employed that supported the draft layouts, but in the end, they were not as helpful. Once the scanning began for the design comps, we realized that the storage and sharing of the files would present a number of problems. I wanted every object to be scanned at a very large file dimension and at a very high resolution. For example, much of the ephemera you're seeing here was letter size with an average type size of between 9 and 12 point type. Scanning them at very high resolution and larger than original size would ensure that all the ephemera would scale up in size and not lose any fidelity. When ephemera, such as newspaper clippings, magazines, and flyers, are scanned at 1200 pixels per inch at 300% of the original size, the fine strokes within the letter forms are captured with enough information that allows a certain degree of enlargement without pixelation or loss of density. All of this meant that the scans are averaging between 500 megabytes to over a gigabyte each in size and took a lot of time to actually capture them. In some cases, the objects were so large that the scan bed would not fit them, and they needed to be scanned in pieces and then reassembled in Photoshop. Readying the art was the next step, which meant that these objects had to be very carefully handled, as they were old and fragile, and sometimes a wrinkle or a dog-eared corner would need to be repaired digitally. Once the scanning, naming, and organizing stage was over, many of the digitized files were repaired in areas where the paper had worn away or was creased. Printing blemishes were removed, backgrounds built out when needed, silhouetting some ephemera to reveal its shape and edges, and straightening and squaring up where needed to make the scan look as close to the original as possible. And then, of course, toning the color and adjusting followed. When working with ephemera and archival content, there can be hours of repair work on some originals and not much on others. Next steps were the design, layout, and production, then review, editing, and proofing. Overall, the final productions of the panels were quite impressive, and there was not one noticeable pixel or blemish that had been missed. The next project part or iteration was the website, which David Cirilla built out the screen version of the exhibit. So now all these supersized files needed to be downsized for the web. That meant every file had to be opened, converted from CMYK color to RGB, and then reduced to 72 pixels per inch. So there was quite a bit of time that went by during which the archived files played musical chairs on various storage devices in my studio, which took almost 50 gigs of space. If you have ever had a hard drive fail unexpectedly, of course, you know that when a request for a project's files come up, anxiety swells until you locate the files and get them transferred to a workable local drive or computer. I began the book design and layout late in 2019, and by October of 2020, it was produced, finalized, proofed, and ready to publish. By then, we had determined to use a print-on-demand vendor, and I chose to use Ingram Spark and publish it through an imprint I am involved with called Octoberworks. There is a website where you can read about the book and find ways to order it on Octoberworks website. So projects like this that include ephemera have become a favorite of mine, and I am working on one that now includes a local woman who left her home and fortune as a public art gallery at 51 Trumbull Street. She was one of 3 women who left their homes to the public good: Grace T. Ely, Hannah Gray, and Mary Wade. So I am researching their histories and will be giving a talk at Southern in April with what I have found out about them so far. I'm trying to put together as much research as I can find on them for that talk in late April. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Jeanne, and thank you, Joan, and thank you, Dorothy, for those presentations. This has really been terrific to delve into these materials, and I want to open the floor of our Q&A function, which you should find there on your Zoom screen. I guess there are sort of 3 areas of questioning and discussion I'd like to raise with our panel. I mean, the first is about the history itself of the place, the company, the labor history, the history of unionism or anti-unionism, the history of opportunity on the one hand and discrimination on the other. I mean, that's one area that we might begin to ask questions. A second area is more around the present. Dorothy has raised this, Joan has raised this, the status of Science Park, of the lofts, of neighborhood change, and of the kind of unequal beneficiaries, if you will, of a renaissance, if there is one here in New Haven. And then the third area, and I'm saying this again for our attendees to start thinking about your questions, is really about public memory. And this gets to what Jeanne has done in processing and representing the ephemera and the materials in such an engaging and persuasive way, and also gets at what Dorothy has called for, which is a new program of remembering and landmarking at the site itself. So, and I'm sure there are other areas, but those are sort of three big themes that I wanted to ask about. And let me just get the ball rolling with one question about the history. And I think maybe Joan and Dorothy, this might be mostly for you, but Jeanne, please jump in as well. One of the things that comes through what both of you have said is, we need to reckon with a sometimes difficult story here of discrimination, of racism, of anti-unionism. And yet, on the other hand, there's a tremendous amount of pride and community building and perhaps even social mobility that is connected to Winchester and the jobs that it created and the lives and livelihoods it facilitated. I mean, Joan, could you say a little bit something about that tension? Winchester being a place that was, and this comes through in Dorothy's oral histories, I mean, a place that was in many ways loved, that was a kind of family, that had drama and singing and sports. And yet the company owners thought that kind of corporate paternalism would ward off the unions, perhaps. And of course it didn't. And there's this dual history of fighting for workers' rights. Is that a tension you grappled with, Joan, in your work here between, the positive elements that Winchester played as a community builder and the more kind of critical perspective of the corporate overseers?
Well, that was exactly what I was trying to talk about when I started out, when I was talking about the contrast, how it's a story of contrasts.
Right.
Because on the one hand, you have this company which is producing guns, engaging, as I pointed out at the beginning of the talk, in some very unseemly practices to sell those guns, including selling them to apartheid South Africa. Is engaged very dramatically, as I describe in the book, in union busting activity, attempts to prevent unionization at the beginning, the lockouts, the real clampdown that they were able to engage in against the organizing efforts of the United Electrical Workers. And previous to that, the International Association of Machinists, which I didn't even talk about, in the very early part of the 20th century, they were also engaged in really trying to smash that union, and also in trying to really play off the skilled, really at that point in the early part of the century, the skilled workers against the unskilled workers, and to reduce the solidarity that would have existed between workers. So there was that element, of course.
Right.
And yet, as I talked and as Dorothy spoke, there was an enormously interactive community that did exist within the workforce among all ethnicities. One of the slides that kind of went by when I was talking showed McDermott's Tavern, which was a gathering place for Winchester workers, one of the many places in the area which catered to Winchester workers. Dorothy described the businesses that were existing in the area, and a lot of those businesses catered to both the neighborhood and the Winchester workers in the neighborhood, because the neighborhood really was connected to that particular plant. There was a tremendous, workforce that came from that neighborhood and worked at Winchester. Other neighborhoods, of course, in the city as well. I don't mean to, ignore those, but that neighborhood in particular was a real anchor for the plant. So you had a tremendously interactive community, both with the plant inside and outside the plant, going on at the same time. And I think the other thing that needs to be looked at is this: when I talked about the 79 strike, the way in which it really wounded the community, the pitting of those four groups of people together, because there's one oral history where one of the workers talks about how painful it was to watch, quote, our police busting heads during that strike, that 1979-80 strike. Those people were also members of the community, as were some of the scabs or replacement workers who went in to take jobs. I regret, actually, there was an email I found in my email just a couple of months ago from a replacement worker who was a member of the community, a scab, and she went in as a scab, and she wrote to me because she wanted to speak about how badly she felt about having had to do that. So that's, it was very contradictory, all of the practices versus what actually happened. But the community was very involved in what was going on in Winchester. There was a tremendous amount of support for the strikers within the community.
Dorothy, do you want to add anything to that about the meaning Winchester had for people in the community, the way that it was perceived at different times in its history?
Well, I know during the strike, the community came together. I wasn't living there at the time, but the community came together in support of the Winchester workers. And also, I think that the young people that lived in the community, they looked up to the workers at Winchester. They were proud of them and what they were doing for the city of New Haven. Because I know myself as a kid, when my father worked there, I was a little girl. I was about 4 or 5 years old. I didn't know anything. All I know, my dad brought money home and we had food on the table, clothes and so forth and so on. But when I got a little bit older, I would go down there with my friend and we would go and see the mother. And then after I interviewed people, I really had a good understanding of what Winchester was really about. Of course, I was much older at the time, but I really understand.
Yeah. And just to follow up on that, Dorothy, what after the interviews, what is the takeaway for you? I mean, there is more than one, I'm sure. What was it all about?
Well, it was about struggle, a very difficult struggle for people.
Mm-hmm.
And I know the union did what they could, but as I stated before, the city should have done more to help the workers because Winchester was a part of New Haven. And after talking to the workers, I felt such a sadness because I know the city could have done better. I know they could have. And it left people that worked there devastated. Like if you're head of the household, mother, father, whoever, you're wondering, how am I going to make ends meet? Where's my next meal going to come from? But, luckily that they were able to get training. I can't remember the name of that program that the Labor Department has where you can get training. And that's what a lot of the folks did. They went and got training, but that sadness stayed with them for a while. It takes time when you lose your job. It takes time for the healing process to really start and end.
And Joan, do you think, was there something that the city could have done more of at that time? I mean, they weren't asking the city to bail out the company exactly. I mean, is it in terms of the city doing more to help ease this transition?
Well, I think you have to look further. You have to look further back at it. I mean, it didn't just all happen in 2006. The city continually. I mean, if you look at the book, I mean, I go through this in rather exhaustive detail. It was a continued repetitive series of loans, tax abatements, and other agreements designed to keep employment at a certain level in the plant. The company or companies that ran the plant continually abrogated those agreements. And the city continually allowed them to go beyond, go below the numbers of employees that they were supposed to be keeping employed there, and continue to get the loans and the tax abatements renegotiated. So yes, I think that it was a long-term sort of arrangement where the city did not step up to the plate and demand that the company live up to the loans that to the agreements that had already been made, so that by 2006 there were only 186 people working there. So the mistakes had been made for a much longer period, through a period of 40 or 50 years.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. And that's right. That there is quite a lot in the book over time and talking about these different agreements. And it's very interesting to think about the public-private dynamic there. I mean, this is something we continue to think about today, the degree to which the public sector should be subsidizing the location of businesses and encouraging certain kinds of development. There's a question here from Jay Tucker. And I wonder if I can actually allow you to voice it yourself, if you'd like to. Do you want to jump in and ask your question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation and for the important work that you're doing. When I heard that your book was out, I got a copy of it. I've given it to colleagues. I'm a historian at Wesleyan University in Middletown, and I am involved with the Radical History Review Journal and interested in labor history, and also have done some research on Connecticut gun history and worked a little bit with the Colt site. And I was very interested. I mean, I have so many questions, so I just wanted to, I guess, first of all, just thank you for your work on this. And just in the interest of time, I mean, I put several questions in the chat just because I had so many, but I will follow up with you. But I was curious, you had mentioned that, so I was curious about whether you thought there were public history projects that you thought would be good models for the kind of, the kind of memory project that you were talking about, the plaques. Are there other kinds of museums or community-based history projects that you think would be interesting to draw upon in interpreting the Winchester site as it's going through these changes? And I guess on a very particular note, I thought I caught mention of a photographer who documented at Winchester. I was curious if I caught her name, if it was Margaret something. I was wondering if she was an employee, and just in general, if you could say a little bit more about the Photographic Archive. Thank you very much.
Well, I don't know the photographer to which you're referring. The photographs really come from a number of different sources. There was the strike photographs that you saw were taken, a lot of them were taken by Joe Taylor, who is a local photographer. But the other photographs, a lot of them came from the documents that were found that I found in the local 609 records. They also came from Winchester, the company publications, Winchester Life, Winchester News, the Olin Target. All of those are available and really interesting to look through. They're actually at the New Haven Museum and Historical Society. So that's where a lot of those came from. Also newspapers and newspaper articles and clippings. And some of them I actually took the stuff that you saw at Science Park at Yale was all stuff I took. But to get back to your other question, I think the listening project that you mentioned is a really, really good model. I would love actually to do a whole lot more oral histories. Not necessarily to write another book. I don't want to do that, but I think it would be great to get a website and another way to tell those histories, because I mentioned before the replacement worker who wrote to me and felt so bad about having done that. I think those kinds of histories would be really important to incorporate, maybe even talk to some of the people who are members of the police force there. So I think those histories are really important. And I don't want to veer off your question, but something appeared in the chat here that I'd like to address, if I may, a little bit. It has to do with how do we keep Yale and the Renaissance crowd from co-opting our attempts at meaningful remembrance, just like they co-opted the space itself. I think it's really, really important that not only there should be plaques, along the Farmington Canal, that talk about, there's some people made guns in this plant, but there should also be a way to incorporate the history that we talk about in this book of the workers who struggled and what those workers' struggles meant. You know, rather than if you go into Winchester Lofts, you'll see some romanticized versions of what it was like to work at the plant. Well, that's not remembering. That's not the kind of remembrance that I think we're talking about, at least certainly not what I'm talking about. I don't think it's what Dorothy's talking about either. I think we're talking about remembering those workers and what actually happened there. And also what actually was the relationship of the city and how did it work and what can go into that place there now, which is much more useful to the people of New Haven than what is currently on that property. I mean, we've got more tax exempt property on that in Science Park at Yale. You know, well, we didn't need that. You know, what do we need? We need learning centers. We need communities. We need community centers. We need housing, real housing. That's another way to remember, real housing that real people can afford.
Yeah. Dorothy, do you want to comment on this point on how to meaningfully remember the site?
Well, I agree basically with Joan, housing, because that seems to be almost a crisis in New Haven and other cities and towns, affordable housing, so that everybody can have a decent place to live and still be able to have food, you know, and clothing, because the rents now are extremely high and a lot of people can't afford it. And a lot of people feel bad that live in the New Halldale area. They put up a loft, Yale, but what about us? Mm-hmm. There is room for everybody, but we have to come and sit at the table and discuss it.
Mm. Absolutely. Such an important point. And I'm being told that we should probably wrap this up soon, but there's one more question that's come in. So why don't we let Aaron ask his question? Aaron, do you want to voice it? You should. Oh no, actually it looks like I can't do this at the moment. So Aaron, let me read your question. Aaron Good asks, what were the racial dynamics at the factory and within the IAM union? Did factory owners attempt to play races against each other to prevent unionization? Was there equality within the union? Does this come up in the oral histories of the workers? Joan, you said something about this in terms of people being played off of each other, but do you want to comment on this question?
Well, if you look at the chapter that I did on the United Electrical Workers, they began to address the racism in the company and the fact that Black workers were getting short shrift. And there's a whole list of demands that or list of conditions that they listed about the way Black workers were being treated. Now, this was in the 1940s when they were seizing the moment because war production was ramping up, and they were thinking this was a good time to strategically bring workers. So that I addressed in about the United Electrical Workers struggle. Dorothy, maybe you want to say something about this too. The machinists, actually the leadership of Local 609 in the later years at least, was often African American. Did you know anything more about the earlier history, Dorothy?
No, I didn't know that much. I didn't know that much about the earlier history, but I know Craig had told me, he was the former president and chief steward too. He told me that sometimes it was difficult for African Americans to get in the leadership, like in their district council. It was quite difficult for them. But, you know, you keep plugging away and let people know I'm not going anywhere. And finally, they accept you. They may not like it, but they have to accept you.
I mean, unions had to struggle with their own racism, and they did so, you know, with varying degrees of success. Let's face it.
Right.
Well, this has been a really, really interesting conversation. And, you know, Joan, just as you say, it really is just a beginning, I think, of our city and our community continuing to discuss this place and its stories. I mean, I really do want to encourage people to look at and get their own copy of Our Community at Winchester. And I think we should probably post the website address. Someone had asked for that earlier as well. I mean, if someone knows it right now, we could throw it in the chat just as we wrap up. But so to Joan and to Dorothy and to Jeanne, thank you so much. Matt, do you want to help take us out here?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to thank you all. This is such a great project. So congratulations on it, and thank you, Joan, Dorothy, and Jeanne. It's incredibly moving, the stories that you tell, and it's a really important piece of our history, because the transition from an industrial society to a post-industrial one is just full of pain. And it's a pain that is not always documented well. And it's also a pain that is hard to talk about without romanticizing the pain of the industrial era. We don't want to paint Fordism as some kind of a golden age either. But I think that you've captured something really important about this city and about its hopes for democracy, if there's going to be such a thing in our future. So thank you for this work. Thank you for the presentations tonight. And thank you to you, Elihu, for helping us out in the discussion tonight. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Good night, everyone. Take care of
Good night.
yourselves. Don't let
All
your
right.
guard down. Don't let your guard down. Wear a mask. Wash your hands. Don't touch your face.
Will do.
Social distance.
Social distance.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
everybody.
All right.
Bye now.
Ciao.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone. Great to talk to you.
Thank you.